Should we start? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our last panel. We have with us today three remarkable panelists. I'm going to start introducing them. I'm going to start with Alia Moubayed. Alia is an experienced economist specializing in emerging markets with a focus on the MENA region. She directed the Geoeconomics and Strategy program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and serves as chief economist for MENA at Barclays. Alia also worked at the World Bank, Banque du Liban, and various Lebanese ministries. We also have with us Imad Salamey. Imad is the chairperson of the Political and International Studies Department at LAU, focusing on political economy, sectarianism, and conflict resolution in the MENA region. He has written extensively on Lebanon's political system, including power sharing and governance after the Arab Spring. Imad is also a policy advisor for various international organizations. And last but not least, one more introduction for the road, maybe. Joseph Bahout is the director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policies and International Affairs at AUB, specializing in Lebanese and regional politics. He has held key roles at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Science Po Paris, a frequent media commentator and author. Joseph's expertise spans political analysis and policy development in Lebanon and the broader Middle East. All right. Lebanon has entered a new phase following the recent ceasefire, one marked by rapid political development, including the long-awaited election of a president and the appointment of a new prime minister. A new central bank governor has also taken office, signaling a potential shift in economic direction. Yet, despite these milestones, the country remains at a crossroads. Lebanon is still struggling with deep structural challenges, a collapsed economy, faded public trust, fragile institutions, and unresolved questions about its regional positioning and internal power-sharing models. The war tolls socially, politically, and economically has only deepened existing fractures. So where do we go from here? Can this moment of transition be seized to chart a new path forward, or will it reproduce the cycles of crisis we know too well? I would like to start first with Dr. Joseph. Would you like me to ask the question, or would you like to just go for it? Yeah. How do you assess the impact of recent political changes in Lebanon? How do you assess the impact of the recent political changes in Lebanon on the country's relationship with neighboring states such as Syria and the Gulf countries?
Maybe before getting to this point, I mean, assessing the relations with the neighboring countries and the Arab countries, a quick assessment, maybe not of the government, but of the political landscape where we are in today. How much do you give me? 5 minutes?
I can, yeah. Sure.
Okay, fine. Let me start first by saying that my main worry today in this context, and this will probably frame part of the conversation, is that there is a sort of pitfall or of polarization between two mindsets in the country. I'm not talking about the government. I'm talking about the political spectrum or the landscape in Lebanon. One that is I think, or still perceive as being excessively triumphalist, meaning that it is maybe overreading the domestic fallbacks of what is happening in the region, thinking that probably the entire landscape has changed, that certain equations are ended forever, that it's time for a restart completely, etc. That is facing another mindset that probably considers or still lives in an excessive denial and still considers that, okay, something has happened, but it's not the end of the world. We can continue business as usual, and even worse, things can be reversed with time, like the history of this country and the region has shown for many, many times. I think this confrontation between the two mindsets is something that is still existing today. You can see it in the opinion, maybe less in the political debate, and this is something unhealthy. I think that something has to be found in the middle, a little bit like when we were discussing Syria in the panel before. Now, with to answer your question quickly, but I'll come back maybe in a later round at the challenges of this government and etc. To answer your question quickly, I think, and at the risk of being simplifying or simplistic, I think that today everybody agrees in Lebanon, or everybody is conscious, if they don't agree, that the main, let's say, mover of things since the election of a president, passing by the formation of a government, and today the debate is mainly triggered, enhanced, and pushed forward by external pressure. I don't want to be also simplistic, but sometimes you have this conversation with diplomats, some of them are here, that we have to acknowledge that the country is today under a sort of international/regional tutelage. Okay, now, I don't want to get into the qualification. Is it good or bad? It's not my business. Okay, any citizen could have their opinion, but this is the state of affairs. So the country, the government, the power, etc., is acting under a strong international constraint that is not anymore hiding. I mean, it's set every day in statements, etc. You have strict deadlines for this meeting, this something to happen, this phenomenon, and then you have the political deadline in the country. I'll come back to it later on, which is the political deadline of the government, which is the elections in less than 1 year. Now, it's in next May. So as of next 2-3 weeks, the country is in an electoral mood, which is not also a normal mood in order to do certain things usually in politics, okay? Because you have a lot of overbidding, a lot of tit and tat, a lot of preposturing, and etc. Now, directly related to your question, what is obvious is that at least on one front, which is a multi-level front, on everything having to do with financing reconstruction, refloating the country's economy, reforming, Alia will talk about it, its banking sector, its financial structure, etc., coping with immediate needs that are not even structural, but are, for example, electricity, infrastructure, water, health system, etc. Nothing can be done without a substantial foreign aid, and mainly under this state of affairs in the world, with this government in the US and etc., mainly this will come from either the Gulf countries or some European friendly countries. So I think that this is where we stand today. The challenges are huge because the stakes are very intricate. I'll quote them quickly and I'll come back to them. You have at the same time the urgency of everything having to do with, call it as you wish, security, sovereignty, ceasefire, deployment, disarmament, okay, this entire structure. You have something that has to do with immediate reconstruction, and I'm separating that from economic reforms, immediate reconstruction of 70 plus villages in the south that are completely flattened, and you have to start somewhere there. And then you have the economic reform, and then you have, and I'll stop there to come back to your question, the regional volatility that is far from being over. I mean, what triggered and produced the change in Lebanon, that is an opportunity maybe, and an opening, is still a shock that has not ended. The shock is still continuing. We see it today, maybe less in Palestine. We see it in Syria sometimes. We see it with Iran. So we have also to brace for a continuous change that could also produce a new set of changes in Lebanon.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Alia, I would like to ask you, Lebanon is facing a multitude of socio-economic challenges amidst a fast-changing regional and global economic landscape. How do you think the new authorities, it being the president, the government, and the central bank governor, should approach those challenges? What should be the priorities?
Sure, thank you very much. I mean, obviously, it's extremely difficult to, we were just discussing that, about setting priorities when, the country is still struggling with what we call on the economic front, the polycrisis, in the sense that we're still in a fiscal debt crisis, a financial crisis, the cash economy, for failure of a previous government to enact any of the reforms that are required since 2020, have actually directly and indirectly contributed to the spread of the informal sector. I mean, it existed before, but obviously the inaction also had it. So it's important to remind people that the cost of inaction over the last 5 years was extremely high, and now suddenly this government with this new president and now a new central bank governor have to face not only the fact of doing what others didn't do, but also try to undo the consequences of inaction. But on top of that, facing the more immediate challenge of dealing with a destroyed country with a very huge, cost of rebuilding that we probably, I'm sure many of you know. The World Bank's assessment, 6.8 billion of physical assets damage, and 7.2 billion in economic losses, and that recovery and reconstruction needs are at a minimum of 11 billion. So on top of the fact that they have to deal with a very negative legacy, they have to deal with this new challenge. And I think, first as a citizen, but also as an economist, I cannot assess performance of this government when election comes in a year's time, similarly to how previous governments. So I think for all of us, my first message is to say that the challenges are much bigger than a normal time to basically and the importance of managing expectation. And I would have liked, actually, that this government and this president would have taken the country, especially after the war, and lay barely to all the citizens and say, okay, this is how we are starting, and it's very, very bad. And we need your patience. And you guys who are attacking us every day on TV and social media, on everything, this is the reality. Come and hold us accountable after 1.5 years. So I think the point is the starting point. My first say is that the challenge is a multitude. But I also think there are silver lining, right? I think this government is taking an economy which, even though the war has set back the growth momentum that we have started to see in 2022-23. But I also think that the silver lining of all this is that the private sector that has been the engine of growth, even and has been recovering fast, even though it has been doing so thanks to the huge deleveraging they have benefited from on the expense of depositors as they close their loans with dollars versus dollars. But you have a private sector that, even if you put a small stimulus in the economy, then you can move faster. And I think this is a positive for this government that needs to be. On the contrary, however, is that the state is underfunded and capacity is very weak to accompany the next stage of these challenges, starting by preparing for the donor community a very solid reconstruction plan and negotiating with the IMF. I myself was a staff of the Central Bank and Ministry of Economy, and I can assure you that both the analytical and technical capacities of those institutions are much worse than after the war in the year 1991, 1992. So with much bigger challenges, you are faced with a much weaker state, but you have a private sector that, if you work with it quite well, you can. And this is why I would say that, and I said it in an article before the formation of the government in Al Mudun, I said there is an agenda of 4 R's, I call it. These are the 4 priority. is first the restructuring. We cannot, restructure everything, because it's an opportunity. You have to start from scratch. We need to restructure the public sector, the financial sector, restructure the state-owned enterprises, because starting by EDL, because it has been the main drag on the private sector and on the balance sheet of the government. So the restructuring agenda is the priority, not only because it needs to be done, and we have failed over the past 5 years, because as Joe said, you cannot move forward with engaging with the international community, but more importantly, with any private sector that is now sort of very excited because of these political changes and wants to invest. So you need to restructure to be able to either do the second R, which is to reconstruct, or to restore the private sector competitiveness and the investment that is needed, starting by adjusting the competitiveness obstacles of energy and telecom, because these are the two largest, basically, obstacles for private sector growth, because the cost of competitiveness is very high. And of course, the fourth R is rebuild the state, right? Rebuild the state away from the clientelistic sectarian base. And I think what this government has done with this new, framework for recruitment of senior civil servant is a good start. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, because you need to see to what extent it will remain away at arm's length from politicians' interventions. Just a reminder, Lebanon, the Lebanese government in 2007 tried to do competitive recruitment for high-level officials, and it didn't. I have a personal experience, because the politicians blocked a lot of many good candidates. So I think this framework, I think, is what is driving, and we heard it also from the Minister of Economy, that this is the framework that's gonna drive the government plan. And I would say, in terms of priority, of course, in the very short term, is getting to the table with the banking sector and get to a minimum accountability deal, that a minimum deal with the banks that, on the one hand, provides enough accountability for society, and for not only for depositors, because not only depositors lost money, but we all have suffered from massive depreciation and devaluation, but also a deal that can allow for the bankers to absorb losses while minimizing the role of the state in bearing the losses, simply because, as I mentioned, the needs of reconstruction are very huge. So if you start now adding the cost of banking sector losses onto the sovereign, then the Lebanese state will not be able to bring back people into their houses anytime soon. So I think the difficulty and the main challenge for this president and this government is to be able to put a deal with the banks that allows for an IMF program, anchor the country in an IMF program, not at staff level, agreement level, as was done and sabotaged in 2022, but at board level by the end of this year, so that you protect this IMF program, which should be, to a large extent, largely owned and by the Lebanese in its different stakeholders after this deal with the banks, but that protects it with the help of the international community from the next cycle of elections.
Thank you, Alia. I would like to stay with you also. I mean, we've seen on the media how there's a lot of there's like a war happening between a lot of media outlets like Megaphone and Daraj against the banking sector. And I mean, yesterday we saw an article from Megaphone that was really talking about how if the banks would like to do the reforms, there's a lot of banks that are mainly against it. There are some banks that will be sold out to some other banks. Amidst this war and amidst, the banking sector and its influence on the government, and maybe its influence on this new government, how can we kind of like try to regain trust in this in this sector, and how can that trust be back to the people, you know?
I mean, the issue of trust is one I always link it to institutions. I think when citizens see that the institutions are fulfilling its role, when they see that the judiciary is becoming independent, and I think it was very clear both from the president's oath and the government statement and the Minister of Justice's priority, that the independence of the judiciary is a priority. I think if you start by here, you are putting the seeds of what should reestablish the trust of, in institutions. Because, as I mentioned, I mean, you can pass the banking secrecy law and you can pass the bank restructuring law, but if you don't have an independent judiciary that is able to follow up on any recourse to the judiciary once you have to remove banking secrecy in order to hold somebody accountable because they are money launderers or they are tax evader, etc., then you're not going to go very far. So I would start really by, this will be for me the most important element of trust, and I understand that in the next few weeks the Minister of Justice will table back the law, and I think this is critical for me as a citizen, but also for any investor, right? I mean, remember what what Mr. Sawiri said like a decade ago when he was asked why you're not investing in Lebanon, or many other investors, but I'm giving his example because he was very vocal about it. He said, I mean, like, let them enforce contract, let them restore their ability to enforce contract, and I will be the main person who would invest. So the ability of the private sector to trust the judiciary also is very important for the recovery, because, as I mentioned, I mean, you need growth to be to be driven by the antithesis of the model that we had. Before, our growth was driven by a debt-creating flaws, right? Now we have to create our growth through make it private investment-led, yeah, and export-led, and that requires the kind of trust of private investors and operators. The trust, I think, also more importantly, to go back to the bank, is about the central bank. Today we have a new central bank governor. I used to be an employee of the central bank. After you have a financial crisis, you need an overhaul of the whole financial sector governance in Lebanon, starting by the central bank, the Banking Control Commission, the Capital Markets Authority. I think that's the second important element of trust, that the regulator is able to implement laws and is not captured by a private interest, and I think that's essential for trust. But I think both internally and externally. But I also think the element of trust is to be built with the international community. Today we have to have in mind that the international community does not have Lebanon on top of its priority list when you have Gaza and Syria and Ukraine and others. So regaining the trust of the internationals requires a very proactive stance, both from the government and the president. You need people who know that what are the policy issues that needs to be put on the table, how you negotiate with the IMF, how you negotiate with the World Bank, how you talk to bondholders. So all these elements of trust also depends again on institutions that are needed as partners for our international development colleagues with whom we are working. So there is this different element of trust. So the citizens through the accountability lens, the private sector through regaining the trust in the currency, in the financial sector, and of course the element of trust from the international community, which has to start from a very credible government program and an ability to implement the reform. So not only the willingness to do so, but also the ability.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I would like to zoom in a bit and ask Ask Imad, in the aftermath of the recent conflict, notably with the death of Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah, how do you anticipate this development will influence the post-war sectarian power dynamics in Lebanon?
Yes, thank you, Ibrahim. And thank you, Joe, for inviting me to this panel. I'm very happy to be here today. Great. You know, so we're thinking about the balance of the confessional groups pretty much in Lebanon right now, following, you know, the military attack by Israel and how this is changing the dynamic. And this is, I think, very important for us to reassess and to see how Lebanon will be going forward from here. Of course, when we think about the confessional balance of power, we think about the Ta'if Agreement, which ended the civil war. We are about to commemorate the 50 years of civil war next week. And the Ta'if Agreement had one issue that continued to create a wedge between the different confessional groups and created another whole problem for the country, and that is the right of the resistance to arms. And understood by that was Hezbollah. In one way or another, it became formulated that Hezbollah is the sole group that has the right to resisting Israel. And then Hezbollah, as we all know, over the years, almost 4 decades, have developed almost a state within a state. It has its foreign relations with Iran. It has its own independent weapons. It has all its structure. So it was, you know, the post-Ta'if agreement, if we want to characterize it in any ways, it's a duality of power. We had 2 states, really. I mean, I know like ambassadors will come and meet with the 3 presidents and will try to assess the situation, but we all knew that that wasn't the real state. There was a state behind that state pretty much driving politics in the country. And therefore, after the Israeli attack on Lebanon, and after it has, you know, inflicted big damage against Hezbollah, including the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the person you mentioned and you referred to, we could speak about a new era, because Hezbollah right now, or the state of Hezbollah in Lebanon, is under siege. So we could speak about September 27 and post September 27 indicated by the assassination of Sayyid Nasrallah. Why now Hezbollah is under siege? There are various, as you all know, various agreements, various UN resolutions working against Hezbollah and trying to shrink the party. Not only the party has been really lost in terms of military and leadership, but now it's under several kind of restrictions. First of it, as you all know, 1701, it has to de-arm from the South Litani River, and maybe as a first step, but also we know it has to be followed by a second step to be de-armed in north of Litani. This is the agreement that so Hezbollah is under that kind of pressure. But most importantly also is 1680. UN Resolution 1680, because Resolution 1680 calls for the demarcation of the Lebanese-Syrian borders. And for that fact, this is actually, for Hezbollah, is a more pressure than 1701. You know, and throughout the Ta'if agreements, Hezbollah used that territory for all kind of smuggling, illicit activities, you know, including the Syrian economy of Captagon that was about $10 billion, and Hezbollah used to benefit from that economy and largely by the smuggling operation and export, using Lebanon and an export site. So now Hezbollah also is under scrutiny in that regard, because now this Captagon and all these trafficking activities is no longer in command. And of course, that That is the implication of the collapse of the Assad regime, which, historically gave all the backing and provided the logistical support for Hezbollah. So this is another aspect that is undermining Hezbollah power or Hezbollah state in Lebanon. Of course, now, like Joe was mentioning, the tutelage, the international tutelage. Okay, and Alia mentioned the issue of how much money we need to reconstruct the country based on the World Bank. And this is also adding to the restrictions on Hezbollah's activity. Why? Because we need $11 billion, right? This is a World Bank estimates. And these $11 billion are conditioned. And what are the conditions? One of it is reform, but also demilitarization of Hezbollah. And Ortegas is stressing this over and over again. So Hezbollah cannot rebuild now the south without this money and cannot operate freely. So there are several issues, very important aspects that are undermining Hezbollah's ability to operate politically and militarily in the south. And therefore, that is giving, in one way or another, more room, more momentum to the existing government and political establishment, especially that this, electing a new president and new prime minister are also independent-minded and reform-oriented. So this is another aspect where we are rebooting the state from the pre-Ta'if or the pre-27 September assassination. Now we have to look forward into how this sectarian balance of power will be adjusted in the country. One very important aspect of that will be to look for the elections. So we are looking for elections. One of it is the municipal election. We may not find much municipal election alignment in terms of politics, but definitely the parliamentarian elections. Right now, Hezbollah and allies in the current parliament control or command around 40 to 45% of the seats. Now, if we will be holding the elections on time in 26, we should be seeing at least a shrink of that size. Under best estimates, Hezbollah's influence in the Lebanese parliament will shrink from 40 to 45% to approximately 28 to 30%. And what I mean by that, not necessarily only the Shiite seats, but we're talking about the seats of its allies. And those allies, whether they were Christians or are Sunni. So those allies will lose their power, especially that they have lost not only Hezbollah as a major ally, but also because the Syrian change of power no longer supporting these MPs. So we will be having a readjustment. It seems to me, at least for the coming years, that we are reclaiming the state as Lebanese in general, and we are giving ways more for reform-minded members of parliament to emerge. I'll stop here on these positive notes.
Thank you. I want to go back to Joseph. What strategies should Lebanon adapt to navigate external pressures and maintain a balanced foreign policy that safeguards its national interests?
Okay, on the question of foreign policy now, of course, everything is interrelated. I mean, foreign policy is the expression of a national will. It's formulated by a government. So this is first, and then it is constrained by the state of what's your environment, what is around you. So it's obvious, I think it's now beyond debate that let's consider the new Lebanon, if we can say so, will have a new foreign policy. Okay, now how to define this new foreign policy is still early. Now, the full disclosure, we are in the course of finalizing a paper here at IFI on what could be this new foreign policy for Lebanon. It will be out in a few weeks, but this is not the topic now. I think that it's obvious that many Lebanese today, if we accept the fringes at the extremes, have become conscious that the alignment on axes and etc. is probably deadly, or at least that you have to shy away from it. Now, to jump from there to talk about neutrality and etc. is something else, because neutrality also is a whole debate in international law. You have several forms of neutrality. You have voices talking about that and expressing this or that aspect. But I think that this is already one thing that has been acquired. The second thing having to do with foreign policy, and here I'm coming back to real issues, I mean real political issues, and not to stay in vague statements and principles and etc. I think that the most important change that happened for Lebanon during the last year is maybe the loss or the erosion of the Iranian axis in the region. This is very important, but I think it's mainly the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. This is the main change, the main structural change. I mean, forget about only the past 20 years of history between Lebanon and Syria. Since the two countries have been incepted and created under the French mandate, you have an organic interrelation between the two countries. Those who tell you something else haven't read history, okay? The crises between Lebanon and Syria in the 50s, when both political structures were very similar in Damascus and Beirut, were as frequent as the ones that we had in the 60s, 70s, and after. They were of a different nature, of a different degree, but there was a friction. And until I think this question is completely resolved, and I'm very happy that I learned today that the Prime Minister is going to Damascus next week. I think it's a very important step. This is something that has to be tackled. Now, here comes what Imad was talking about, probably the deep malaise of Hezbollah that I think was much bigger after the fall of the Syrian regime than even after the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. I think it was deeper. The malaise was deeper. Now, the question here and the contradiction becomes to what we were talking about before, this tutelage. How can you be at the same time in a position of neutrality and distancing and na'ib al-nafs, as we call it in Lebanon, which is the best way to talk about distancing itself, and at the same time becoming in dire need of financing from a certain crowd in the Arab community or in the international community. This is, I think, a catch-22 for Lebanon. And it will, on the road, on the way, we will find new contradiction in the formulation of this foreign. It's very easy to say we want to be neutral, we want to be friends with everyone, and etc. Okay, what about if, and I take an example that has been on the table a few years ago, what about Russia offers you, for example, armament for your army? What will you do with your neutrality? Okay, so this is only one example. I want maybe from there to jump to something else that Imad has mentioned. It has maybe a very distant relation with foreign policy, but I think it is related. And we are here connecting to things that we have said before, mainly in the Syrian panel. This is why also the Syrian-Lebanese relation is important. To continue on this sectarian balance or imbalance and etc., and I said it in my introductory remark, what I'm afraid of, if you look at things a bit more widely and in time and space, okay, and you take a step back, what I'm afraid of is that the last year and a half of events in the region that have completely broken what we call the Iranian axis have in a way or another, and I'm sorry if we talk in these terms, have created a sense in, I would say, the Shia community in Lebanon and in the region, a sense of, let's say, weakening, maybe, and I hope I'm wrong, a sort of humiliation, and maybe a quest for reparation. Okay, so far it's already important, but what becomes grave and dangerous is that this is succeeding a decade and a half of the same feeling and sentiment in the Sunni community. I mean, since the war in Iraq, the catching of Saddam Hussein and his death, the death of Yasser Arafat, the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri in Lebanon, you had what we called in Lebanon and elsewhere a Sunni Mazlumi, a Sunni miserabilism, a Sunni Nakba, okay? The war in Syria was the epitome of that. Bashar al-Assad was continuing to decimate the Sunni community. Today, with what's happening, what happened in Lebanon, what is happening in Iraq, and what could maybe happen with Iraq, plus the feeling of triumphalism in certain segments. This is why I said there is maybe an overreading of what has happened on the Lebanese domestic scene. You have a feeling of triumphalism in certain communities in Lebanon, at least in certain areas in Lebanon. We were having discussions privately during dinner yesterday that, for example, if you go to Tripoli or to Akkar, you can see pictures and portraits of Shara that are raised there, that are delegations from Mukhtars in Akkar or in Tripoli or in the north going to Damascus in order to put demands to Ahmad Shara that has to do with Lebanese politics. So let's forget about these small issues of... I think that this is the main challenge today in the region. I maybe made a detour, but this has to do with the formulation of your foreign policy. And your foreign policy will have to do with this at a moment where you have a very strong pressure. We come back to the tutelage. For example, okay, ceasefire, deployment of the army, disarmament. These are very nice words. Let me be more granular. Okay, you take out the weapons. You take out the missiles. You have in this country something like 70,000 people today under arms in Hezbollah. Okay, 40,000 if you don't want to go too far, who are trained, ideologized, and they never did anything else but bearing arms. What will you do with them? This is a question I'm putting to the government, okay? I'm of the generation who lived, for example, the demobilization of militias after the war. We forgot what it was. We tend to forget, but part of, and Alia maybe will confirm, part of the deep corruption of the Lebanese state structure and administration has to do with the fact that you were obliged, because this is sociology, this is real life, to melt these militiamen into the administration of the state, into the security forces, into the army, into the Gamarik, into the customs, so these people come with a culture. What will you do? And these are the serious questions that the government today has to address. This is what state building is. Yeah. It's not only writing a draft law and etc. I never heard this debate open yet in the country. Okay, after you have taken out the missiles, what will you do with the personnel that is there? What will you do with the ideology? What will you do with the civil organization? We were talking about that in Syria, and this is the challenge of Shara. We will have the same challenge, and this has to do with also the way you will deal with your environment that is all of a sudden asking you to act as if your country was a new country with new people that has no history, no sociology, no territorial routing, etc., etc. And I think that these are the real challenges that we are facing, and we are facing them under, again, the limit of time and under a very strong pressure from the international community that is both at the same time needed and understandable, but that could become also lethal at some point.
Thank you so much. I want to move to Q&A in a bit. I just have one last question. Maybe Imad can answer me. Maybe Joseph, if you can interfere, I would love that. Based on what was just mentioned now, what guarantees, if any, can truly protect Lebanon from future Israeli aggressions, and if the right to resist occupation doesn't have a place in Lebanon's national defense policy anymore? I mean, should the idea of resistance be redefined or restored in a more inclusive national way beyond sectarian lines?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very difficult question to answer because, we're kind of simulating the situation. there are many countries around that have no balance of power vis-a-vis Israel, and yet they are in kind of situation of stability, right? And what makes this stability possible is first and most importantly is that you have a one sole legitimate entity that is speaking on behalf of the nation. And that legitimate entity is elected, so it's speaking really for the interests of the population that has elected that entity. So this is very important to have a one government, one state, one armed actors. So this provides you with the ability to deal with the international community in much more effective ways. And eventually, once you have that international and sense of legitimacy, you can negotiate everything you want in terms of solutions to existing security matters and make a unified stand by the population against any potential incursions by the Israelis. Of course, Lebanon is in no match militarily to stand up to Israel, and that's why it requires so many other assurances. We have seen that option of resistance by non-state actors that are tied to a foreign country has not necessarily brought to Lebanon resiliency against that aggression, nor was able to defeat the Israeli invasion, if you will. So we need to be, first of all, part of the international community. We need to be part of the Arab community. We need to have a legitimate entity, and that will strengthen our position in case Israel wanted to, in any future, wage any military action. So this is very important, and that's still not an assurance, In case Israel we've done all of this and still Israel invaded us, then we could, speak about other options where all the Lebanese become involved, even if it required a resistance, an armed resistance, in non-formal or asymmetric ways. But that means all the Lebanese have to be part of that resistance. It has to come from the Lebanese to be in an inclusive ways and legitimate ways, rather than to be, single sect, single party, single country supporting, and then you go into what agenda are you pursuing in this, and so forth. So it's, even if we were to speak about armed resistance, it has to be thought of in a appropriate ways, in an inclusive way of all the Lebanese. And this is something that can be included in any future, like a defense strategy or any thinking by the Lebanese army on how and what strategies to put forward in order to protect and defend the country. So this is very important to have.
Thank you. Should we move